We've got everybody checked in and ready to roll.
Go ahead, you're open to both.
3,
Put it over the slate now.
2, 1. Take camera 1. Go, Johnny.
Welcome to Washington Post Live.
That was quite an intro. My gosh, we should probably just leave it right there.
I've hit the big time. Washington Post. I can go home and tell my parents what I did today.
Between Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Washington Post Live itself, we are now reaching hundreds of thousands of homes across all 50 states.
The power of this platform is it takes people into the world of ideas.
Audience members of Washington Post Live are part of the conversation.
Audience or viewer question from George Kralovic from Virginia asks, now that we have the Inflation Reduction Act, do we still need a price on carbon?
Whether it's with cancer scientists or politicians.
This panel, I think, was originally called, 2 women against Putin. It really should be 3 women against Putin. And so
the better way to get things done, as I've demonstrated, is by putting a group together and negotiating something that's good for both points of view.
I think Washington Post Live has given us as a newspaper a new platform, a common meeting ground.
When they're sitting in their own space, there is a sense of ownership and comfort.
It's great that you guys have expanded into these formats to give people a greater ability to have a longer conversation. So I look forward to talking to you today.
And their individuality comes through more so than just their titles.
Thank you for being the agents and the warriors of the light and truth.
That is the lock from the night of the burglary.
Jeff Bezos bought it at an auction.
Right.
And we're trying to find out how much Bezos paid.
Right. Come back next week.
I'm so grateful to be on a platform like the Washington Post. I subscribe, I read, I love the Washington Post.
Thank you.
We need films like this. So thank you very much. Stephen, Lynn, it's been great to talk to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Big fan. Thanks for talking to us.
I cannot thank you all enough.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Post. I'm Fred Ryan, publisher. I'd like to thank all of you who are here in person, as well as those who are watching online around the world. Vladimir Kara Murza is an opinions contributor to the Washington Post. He's long been an advocate for freedom in Russia and has been a courageous champion for democracy. He was arrested in Moscow last April after criticizing Russia's unprovoked and brutal invasion of Ukraine. Since then, he has faced harsh and inhumane conditions and charges that are politically motivated and intended to silence him. The Washington Post has an unwavering commitment to defending press freedom. Vladimir is not the first journalist to be targeted. Jamal Khashoggi, Austin Tice, and Jason Rezaian, all are examples of the constant threat that journalists face around the world. Vladimir's sentencing today is a searing reminder of how vital it is and important it is to ensure the safety of journalists as they do their work wherever they may be. A threat to free speech anywhere can be a threat to free speech everywhere. As the harsh treatment of Vladimir is unfolding, the world is closely watching the Russians' wrongful detention of Evan Gershkovich from the Wall Street Journal. It is essential that all of us who stand for press freedom stand for Evan, and that we not rest until he is safely back home. Evan, Vladimir, Austin are real-time examples of the risks that journalists face and the need for all of us to use our voices to call for our elected leaders to take every possible step to secure their release. In the case of Vladimir Kara Murza, today is a particularly dark day. Earlier this morning in Moscow, he was sentenced to 25 years in Russian prison. This cannot be allowed to stand, and we must all raise our voices against it. Today, we are joined by Vladimir's wife and his attorney, who are here to talk about his sentencing, the challenges that lie ahead in getting him released, and what this means for the future of free speech in Russia. We are grateful that they've chosen to be with the Washington Post at this crucial moment. Washington Post opinions editor David Shipley will be on stage with our guests in just a few moments. But first, we have a quick video.
no doubt that this was a response to my political activities in the Russian opposition. I think more specifically in response to my work on the Magnitsky Act.
You were very, very sick and went back. Now, are you finished? Are you saying I'm not going back anymore?
Oh God, no, of course not. First
You're
of all,
going to go back?
Of course, I will absolutely go back to Russia. I'm Russian, this is my country, and I believe in what I do.
Good morning, and welcome to the Washington Post. I'm David Shipley, editorial page editor here. It's only been a few hours since Vladimir Kara Murza was sentenced to 25 years in prison. As Bill Browder wrote this morning, the harshest political sentence since Stalin's time. We are humbled to have his wife, Evgenia, and his defense attorney, Vadim Prokhorov, with us today following the news. Evgenia, Vadim, welcome. And Evgenia, let's start with you and your reaction to the sentencing. I'm going to read a moving tweet that you sent out this morning. A quarter of a century is an A+ for your courage, consistency, and honesty in your years-long work. I'm infinitely proud of you, my love, and I'm always by your side. What are your reactions?
My reaction is exactly what you read. I am very lucky to be sharing my life with someone I don't ever have to be ashamed of, with someone I'm always proud of, someone I deeply admire and deeply respect, someone who is serving as the best example to our kids. I'm a very lucky woman. And I understand that this sentence is the high recognition of the effectiveness of Vladimir's work. He has proven time and again that he would not back down, that he would not abandon his fight, that he would not betray his country and betray his ideals, that he would keep on fighting. And this sentence shows that they're so afraid of him and they hate him so much for his consistency, for his courage, for his amazing bravery. They're so afraid of him and they hate him so much that they want to lock him up for a quarter of a century.
What is this fight about?
A Russia that we all want to see.
And what Russia is that?
A Russia where human rights are being respected. A Russia where the government does not persecute its own citizens for opposing the official narrative. A country that does not represent a threat to its closest neighbors and to the world in general. A Russia, a free Russia, a democratic Russia. A Russia where our kids can live knowing that there is no risk to their lives or to the lives of their father, to the life of their father. This is a Russia that we all want to see, and this is the only Russia that will stop being a threat to itself and its neighbors.
How have you talked to your kids about their father's arrest and trial?
Well, our kids have been living with this for years. They have been growing up with this. When Vladimir was poisoned for the first time, our oldest daughter was only 9 years old. When he was poisoned for the second time, she was 11. Now our youngest one, our son, is 11, and his father was just sentenced to 25 years of strict regime. So our kids have long understood who their father is, and they know exactly who their father is, and they know that the entire world admires his bravery and stands with him. So I think that it keeps them, I'm sure that it helps them. This is absolutely nightmarish, what we're going through as a family, but it is also absolutely nightmarish what we're going through as a country. The Russian state has made Russia a country aggressor.
Well, let me talk about the state for a second. Vadim, as his attorney, what were you expecting out of Moscow? And maybe you can tell us about the court that judged Vladimir, and then do either of you think there was a situation under which he could have gotten a fair trial?
So it's necessary to claim that the criminal case against him was nothing to do with justice just from the beginning. It was absolutely unlawfully initiated, absolutely unlawfully investigated. And the hearings at the court were absolutely illegal also, because they were held behind closed doors. It's absolutely illegal, even for the cases on the accusation of state treason in Russia, because in fact there were no any secret documents, nothing. There was about 37 pages in one of the volumes, in the 5th volume, any information that FSB thinks about his activity, something like this. It's not, in fact, it's not state secret, but it was the reason, absolutely formal reason, to claim this hearing behind closed doors, without any visitors, without any journalists, who were waiting for us, his lawyers, just near the entrance to the court. And it was it was absolutely illegal, even for our legal system, contemporary legal system. I think that, so there was a strong violence of his freedom to defense, because our requests to attach any international documents of the international organizations which Russia is still the member of, for example, the documents of the United Nations, the documents of OSCE, and so on, about the crimes, military crimes of Russian military forces in Ukraine, or about the illegal character of the new laws which have been held against Vladimir. All of our requests have been refused, unfortunately, by the chairman judge. And much more, there is a very interesting fact that the chairman of the judge's board, I mean Mr. Sergei Podoprigorov, who was the senior judge in this case, he was included into Magnitsky Act, into Magnitsky list, and everybody knows that Vladimir himself, he's one of the main initiators and promoters of Magnitsky Act. So it's very difficult to imagine more conflict of interest in comparative with such a situation. But our protests against this situation have been declined by the other judges. So I think that this case had nothing to do with justice. It's just a political revenge against Vladimir, caused his political activity. It's, we could claim that just now he's the most prominent political opposition leader in Russia, and he's a political prisoner, there's no doubt.
You saw him most recently of anyone. Can you tell us about his current condition?
You mean about his health?
Yes.
Yeah, it's I think it's the main problem, because as Evgenia has told already, he was twice poisoned. In May of 15 and in February of 17. We think that cost on his political activity. These poisons have been caused by his political activity against Putin's regime. And as the consequence of these two poisons, there is a very strong disease, polyneuropathia. It's a very difficult, very strong disease, and this disease is even included into the list of the diseases which are in contradiction with the ability to be punished to the prison. But it's no concerns to our authorities, and unfortunately his health has been worsened. During his appearance in pretrial detention center in the northwest of Moscow, and unfortunately this disease is difficult to treat even in freedom, and moreover it's absolutely difficult. It's maybe impossible to treat in the conditions of the prison. And so just now it's possible to claim that these long years imprisonment for him is quite some kind of death penalty. Yeah. It's necessary to struggle for his release.
It is hard to imagine that prison doesn't drain your health at a high rate.
Yeah, absolutely.
What state is he in, Evgenia? How much can he survive?
Well, Vladimir has always been a very strong person, so he remains a very strong person inside. His strength is absolutely amazing. But of course, those poisonings have definitely affected his health in a very bad way. And the fact that after a year of pretrial detention and some time that he spent in solitary confinement, those polyneuropathy symptoms not just returned, but now seem to be spreading to his right side. Polyneuropathy can lead to paralysis, and the symptoms are spreading. So I do realize that he doesn't have 5 years, let alone 25. For Vladimir, his physical state has never been an impediment to him continuing his work. In 2015, after the first poisoning, as soon as he could stand and walk, he took his cane and wobbled back to Moscow. In 2017, he did the same thing after going through physical rehabilitation here in the United States. Right away, when he was cleared by the medics, he went back. Yeah. So I know that, over this year in pretrial detention, he has never mentioned anything about his physical state to me in his letters. He talked about other things, and he was actually worried about me and the kids. The man who was facing a 25-year prison sentence, a man who's already dragging both his feet because of those symptoms, polyneuropathy symptoms. He was saying how worried he was about the kids and me.
I mean, I'm thinking of that earlier clip that was shown about his willingness to go back.
A stubborn man.
How did you react?
Well, when I married the guy 20 years ago, he was the same.
Yeah.
So nothing much changed. I mean, it's just, it would have been very weird for me to suddenly start saying that now is the time to drop it. Yeah. Now is the time to give up. I realize that the risks are very high. That nightmare not just approached our home, it went in and stayed in 2015 when first Boris Nemtsov was assassinated. Vladimir's close friend and colleague and godfather of our second daughter, younger daughter. And then only 3 months after that, Vladimir was poisoned for the first time. Our kids saw their father in a coma and then unable to walk for months after poisoning, twice in 2 years. But I do admire him for his position. He gives so much strength to people around him, even from behind bars. Many people over this year have been writing to me saying how inspiring Vladimir is. From behind bars, dragging his feet, he still inspires. So how could I tell him to give up on his fight? How can I tell to someone like this to give up? Yeah. No, I will stand by his side for as long as it takes me. I am proud of my husband. I am.
Can you speak more broadly about the state of political prisoners in Russia today and how Vladimir is illustrative of what's going on? At a practical level, what would make one a target? What is the wider scope of repression in Russia today?
You asked a very good question. You said, what can make one a target? Anything. You go out in the street with a blank piece of paper, you go to prison for up to, 15 years? You go out with a copy of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, you go to prison. You exchange price tags at a local supermarket with information about the war in Ukraine, like Alexander Skochilenko did, a young artist from St. Petersburg. She went to prison. Or, for example, you make a post about the bombings of the theater in Mariupol, like Maria Ponomarenko did. You go to prison. You draw an anti-war picture at school. The police will come to your house, arrest your parents, and deprive them of parental rights, like it happened to Maria and Alexei Moskalyov. She was the girl, she was 12 when she drew that picture at school, made that drawing at school. Our son is 11. He brings very similar drawings from school of Ukrainian soldiers, of Ukrainian kids. I'm proud of him for doing that. And Alexei is also proud of his daughter. But when she did this, the police came to their house. They beat him up. They initiated a criminal case against him. They put Masha in an orphanage and deprived her of any contact with the outside world. And the authorities are now, the criminal case against Alexei is ongoing. He's already been sentenced to 2 years, but they might add some time to that. And Masha, the authorities are now in the process of deliberating whether to deprive Alexei of parental rights, because according to the Russian authorities, he is unable to raise a strong Russian patriot, apparently. Over 20,000 people have been detained across the country in 78 regions at least, according to OVD Info, an independent media project on political persecution in Russia. There are over 500 criminal cases against people for protesting against the war. There are thousands, over 10,000 cases, administrative cases, initiated against protesters. And in Russia, an administrative case is very often just a step before the authorities initiate a criminal case against you.
I mean, it's hard to think about what this does to a generation of young people.
Now the Russian schools, each week at Russian schools begins with a lesson about what's important. So basically, a very heavily ideology-heavy lesson about patriotism, about Nazis in Ukraine, or is it Satan now? I've lost the, you know, the narrative has been changing over these months. So it was Nazis in the beginning, that at some point Medvedev talked about Satan, and that there were other things as well. So whoever it is, they're fighting now, you know, but the kids are being told about what's important, about how they should be good Russian patriots, about what it means to be a good Russian patriot. And that means telling on your schoolmates if you notice that they're doing something that contradicts the official narrative. It means telling on your parents. It means supporting the Russian government and its policies. It means not questioning anything, taking all the state-controlled information, that propaganda, as a given. So this is what the regime is trying to do to the new generation. But you know, it's they're doing the same with Ukrainian kids. They've stolen over 20,000 Ukrainian kids and brought them to Russia to be, again, educated as strong Russian patriots.
There is, you know, consistent with that is a broadening of other approaches of repression, Vadim. And there are a number of Americans or people with ties to the United States who've been wrongfully detained recently. Evan Gershkovich, Brittany Griner, Paul Whelan. Is there a correlation, you think, Vadim, between these prisoners and Vladimir?
So I think that there is no doubt that Vladimir is a political prisoner in Russia. He has claimed as a political prisoner by a very influential human rights organizations, for example, as Amnesty International and as Memorial, and there is no doubt that only reason of his detention is his political activities. At the same time, he has twin citizenship. He is also a UK citizen, but unfortunately the Russian authorities do not concern to this subject.
So is an appeal possible?
Yeah. They claim that from their point of view, he's only a Russian citizen. And in fact, he's a real Russian politician. And also he lives in Russia and in US. And so I can say that he's historian. He's a historian. He has a brilliant education, Trinity College of Cambridge. And one of his favorite periods in the history of our country, there is a period of the 70s and 80s in the history of the Soviet dissidents. And the lives of some prominent Soviet dissidents have been saved by the international swap, international exchange. Mm-hmm. For example, our friend, Vladimir's friend Vladimir Bukovsky, who was a prominent Soviet dissident, was changed in December of 76. There was a change between Chilean Communist Party leader Luis Carvalhan was changed by Vladimir Bukovsky as a prominent Soviet dissident. So there are several examples of this international exchange.
Would he accept a swap?
Yeah, and I think that maybe it's not so matter just his prison sentence, 20 years or 22 years or maybe 25 years. His health is quite poor just now, and it's very dangerous for him anyway. And so I think that it's necessary for international society, international community, for international public diplomacy to think about the history of the Soviet dissidents movement, and to think about these things.
Evgeny, I want to come back to something that you were saying about in your description of the regime. because regimes do fall. They do come to an end. It happened once before. But how do you rebuild or build democracy after regime collapse in a sustainable way and create systems that are resilient? Is there any chance for a rebirth of the 1990s in Russia?
Well, there is always a chance. You know, I'm not a politician, I'm not a political expert. If Vladimir were here, he'd give you a very long, detailed program for tomorrow's Russia. He would point out what exact mistakes were made in the 1990s and how they could be avoided in the future. He would just be... this is also why it is so important to save people like this, because in order to have that democratic Russia, we need to make sure that the people who understand the situation, who know what's happening, and who, despite all the risks, continue fighting this monstrous regime, somehow survive now. Because they're going to be the ones willing to undertake the huge task of rebuilding a country from ruins of the Putin regime. And well, I do understand that a very important thing will have to be done, and that is we will have to reflect and understand everything that has been done by the regime, and not just Putin's regime, but the Soviet as well. The crimes that were committed by dictatorships. We need that reckoning with the past will be absolutely essential to building a democratic Russia. Without that recognition of the past crimes, without understanding and contrition, we cannot move forward. That I certainly understand. And I also understand that the society, the state in which society, Russian society is today, is the result of a very consistent state policy. You know, that destruction of social institutes, that destructions of freedoms in the country. That is not, of course, a healthy society, but this is the result of a very consistent policy that has been implemented for decades in our country. This is, we're talking about society that has been deprived of any democratic freedom that is guaranteed to Russian citizens by the Russian constitution. But there is no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly, no freedom of association, no free media, no free and fair elections, nothing. So yes, we will have to carry out a huge work trying to change that, to rebuild those institutions, to rebuild a system of checks and balances, and yes, to understand what had been done by the regimes in the past, very often with the silent complicity of the people.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine impunity or Putin's impunity taking place overnight. This is something that has built up over years. What responsibility do we outside Russia have to, because we played some role in that. What role did we play, and how should we think about our relations with Russia?
Well, the terrible aggressive war against Ukraine is indeed the result of over 2 decades of impunity that Vladimir Putin has enjoyed while committing very similar crimes with no consequences for himself or the regime that he's built. He's already invaded territories of sovereign states before. He invaded Georgia in 2008. He annexed Crimea in 2014. His regime, his government already committed war crimes before in Chechnya and in Syria. He violently squashed peaceful protests over the years in Russia, time and again, sending people to prisons with absolutely mind-boggling sentences. All of that has never received any appropriate reaction from the Western democratic society. Never. So, emboldened by this continuous impunity, Vladimir Putin decided that he could get away with anything. And he launched this war of aggression that has resulted in a humanitarian catastrophe, an unthinkable humanitarian catastrophe. Over 8 million refugees, hundreds of kids dead, killed, thousands of them stolen, thousands and thousands of civilians killed. This is definitely the result of the over 2 decades of impunity of Vladimir Putin's regime. And in order to stop this impunity has to stop, first of all. Vladimir Putin needs to realize that he will not be allowed to get away with anything like this anymore in the future. And I believe that a very strong signal of that would be helping Ukraine to the full extent so that it can win this war on its own terms. I believe that this is crucial, because if this regime is allowed to represent anything like the victory in this war, it will only continue. It will regroup and attack again. Might be Moldova next time, one of the Baltic states. I don't know. He's got a choice in that region because he believes that it's all his. He's restoring the Soviet Union. So he cannot get away with committing those crimes anymore. He has to be shown that he will be stopped. And the victory on Ukraine's terms means that Russian soldiers, every single Russian soldier, has to leave the Ukrainian territory, including the illegally occupied zones. This will send a clear signal to the government in Moscow that it will not be allowed to get away with committing those crimes. And it will also send a very clear signal to other dictators of the world who are watching. Because this is what they do. These dictatorships, they watch each other and learn from each other and see how far they can go without being punished.
But on that, Vadim, reporting the basic act of journalism is a small part of accountability, on reporting, on countering impunity. What do you want other journalists and media executives to know about the fight to protect journalism in Russia and free speech in general?
Sure, it seems to me that it's a quite difficult situation because a lot of journalists are under attack in our country. And some of my colleagues, lawyers, try to help them. And you could see that some of them are even arrested. And just there is an example of when an American journalist has been arrested even in Yekaterinburg. And so it's absolutely, it was done by purpose by Putin's regime, but it's absolutely real steps against freedom of speech, as Evgenia has said already. And so there are a few brave journalists in Russia who are going to make their activity. I think that Vladimir Kara Murza, he's a politician, but he's a journalist also, and he is a son of a famous journalist. He's a famous journalist himself. He has a column in Washington Post, and he's very proud of it. And so I think that it's necessary to struggle for the freedom of speech, and by the way, for the freedom of defense, because some of the lawyers are also under attack just now. They're threatened, and it's not quite easy to make their own job, their own duty as lawyers and as a journalist. And so I think that it's one of the most necessary goals, tasks to try to defend journalism in Moscow, and to try to defend their right to be right to defense.
I mean, these are very different cases of Evgenia. But the Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich has been detained and accused of espionage. As Vadim mentioned, Vladimir's father was a journalist. What's your message to the Gershkovich family and to Evan's colleagues at the Wall Street Journal?
Well, my message, I think, is that they should be, and I think they are, proud of their son or husband or partner, because, just a couple of days ago, I spoke to a few journalists who interviewed me from Russia. They were journalists representing different media, but who chose to stay in Russia even after the arrest of Evan Gershkovich. And because they told me that they believed it was their duty to report about the situation from the ground. Because they said that everything that is being said about Russia from the outside, that look from the outside is always slightly warped. Being on the ground, they see how the situation develops. Being on the ground, they see what repressions are actually going on in the country. They see how harshly and fiercely the authorities are fighting any kind of dissent. Mm-hmm. And they believe it is their duty to remain in the country for as long as they can to report on that. And I was awed by this. I could not even express my admiration for their courage and for their work. So I believe that journalism today is just as important as any time, but in a situation in which we are today in Russia, their work is hugely important. The remaining 3 independent media in Russia, the Dozhd TV, Echo of Moscow radio station, and Novaya Gazeta, have all been closed down in March, very shortly after the full-scale invasion had broken out. Over 200,000 online media resources have been blocked by the authorities. And all social media platforms have been blocked by the authorities in Russia to isolate the Russian population from any kind of independent information about what was going on in Ukraine, what is going on in the country. And so the entire media space has been basically cleansed by the regime. And it is, I think that the fact that last year Russia placed second worldwide by the number of VPN services installed in the country shows that there is a huge demand for independent information, and that demand needs to be met, and it is met by those specific journalists who continue the work from both inside and outside of the country. Hundreds of Russian journalists were forced to leave, and they continue the work.
On that encouraging note, that maybe today marks some sort of a beginning, even though there's a lot of hardness associated with it. I want to thank you both for coming. And I want to thank everyone here for joining us today. To learn more about the Washington Post Press Freedom Partnership, please go to washingtonpost.com/pressfreedom. And thank you very much.
Thank you.